The first humans to sight and possibly visit Alcatraz were the Aboriginal people of the San Francisco Bay Area, the early Native Americans. They were foragers who relied on the Bay Area's plentiful plant and animal life. They traveled across the bay in Thule reed boats and probably used the island as a safe haven in storms. They would have seen it as a stark rock with little vegetation, crowded with birds. And that was Alcatraz's relationship to humankind until about 200 years ago, when Spaniards began exploring and colonizing the west coast of North America. An expedition leader in 1775 named Juan Manuel de Ayala gave it its name when he noticed the island's many pelicans. 75 years later, in the 1850s, the Bay Area was a very different place. California was now the 31st state. The gold rush was on in the nearby Sierra foothills. San Francisco was a boom town of more than 20,000 people. And San Francisco Bay was the West Coast's most important harbor. The U.S. government decided that ships in the bay needed a lighthouse, and the entire Bay Area and its gold needed military protection. Alcatraz was perfectly placed for both. Construction of the West Coast's first operating lighthouse began in 1852, and the Army began building its fortress on Alcatraz in 1853. At the top of the island, the Army built a defensive living quarters called the Citadel. Its 3-foot-thick walls held soldiers, officers, and officers' families. Today, the top floors of the Citadel are gone, but parts of it can be found below the Federal Penitentiary cell house. Just one floor below the cell house, you can still find the remains of the Citadel. Now, this is the dry moat that once protected the Citadel. It used to be open to the sky, but now the cell house is built on top of it. And this is the exterior wall of the moat. It's brick built on solid stone. Over here, along the wall, the basement wall of the Citadel, you can still find the narrow slits from which soldiers would fire their rifles in case of attack. Also built in the 1850s was the guardhouse. This was the gateway to the rest of the island. And here in the basement of the guardhouse is the very first jail on Alcatraz Island. Now, housed in this very tiny space were dozens of soldiers who had disobeyed orders, broken laws, or deserted. Also housed in here were Californians who were sympathetic to the Confederate side during the Civil War. Now, in those days, there were no doors in here. Only narrow gun slits in the walls allowed in a little bit of light. And the only access to this place was through that trap door in the ceiling. And as the need for a fort in the middle of the bay decreased, the need for an isolated Army prison increased. Hundreds of prisoners were now regularly incarcerated on the island. They were everything from Indians who had resisted the U.S. Army, to prisoners from the Spanish-American War, to people who had rejoiced at the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. For most of them, prison life on Alcatraz was grim. Shortly after the turn of the century, military prison conditions changed, mostly for the better. The Army came to terms with the idea that there was no longer a need for a fortress, but there was a need for a better-maintained prison. In 1909, the top floors of the old Citadel were destroyed and replaced by the new permanent cell house, the outside of which you see today. This building could hold more than 500 inmates. In 1915, when the cell house opened, the prison also had a new philosophy: less retribution and more rehabilitation. And to emphasize this, it was given the name disciplinary barracks. Despite the harshness of life for some, the program was generally considered a success. Many of the inmates received vocational training at this facility on the north side of the island called the Model Industries Building. Many of them ultimately returned to the regular Army or were released to society. But running a prison on an isolated island that had no water and had to supply its own electricity was extremely expensive. And in 1933, the Army decided to close down the disciplinary barracks.
And here's America's Devil's Island, grim and inaccessible.
The maximum security federal prison on Alcatraz opened in 1934. The first 32 inmates were Army prisoners left over from the disciplinary barracks. The first group to come from another prison was from the federal penitentiary at McNeil Island in Washington State. Throughout the year, more and more came, and by the end of the first year, there were more than 200. For all prisoners, arriving at Alcatraz was an intimidating experience. The worst of the worst, the toughest of the tough, were sent to Alcatraz. They included criminals like Alphonse Scarface Capone, George Machine Gun Kelly, Alvin Creepy Karpus, and the Birdman, Robert Stroud. Almost all of them began their time in other penitentiaries. There they developed troublesome records, and because of this, were transferred to Alcatraz.
On the Rock, pitched battle raged from the first alarm.
Throughout the history of the federal penitentiary, there were 14 escape attempts by 36 men. 7 were shot and killed, 2 drowned, and only 5 were never accounted for. Escape was frequently thought of, but rarely attempted. The isolation and security of the island made any attempt seem almost suicidal. But driven by confinement, escape attempts did occur. Convicted kidnapper Jim Quillen remembers his.
This is a kitchen basement, and this is an area here that was divided off from the rest of it with a low retaining wall there where we could walk back and forth in here. One day while walking and looking for a way to escape, we saw this lid in here and wondered what was in here. And we got the lock picked and found out that there was a passageway under here down all the way to what we thought went clear to the powerhouse. We got in there and explored it, got a flashlight, but we couldn't go out the end because it had been blocked off, so we decided to try to go through the walls. Now, the heat in here varied from 145 to 160 degrees. It was too narrow and too small for 2 people to turn around in, so we have to have one person back in, one person crawl in, then reverse it when we came out. You would sweat, the sweat would hit those pipes, and it was just sizzle. And if you broke one of the pipes, you were going to be instantly cooked because that was live hot steam. That was my greatest fear. We tried real hard to get through the wall down there, but unfortunately somebody snitched us off, and as a consequence, we went to D block. And so, but if we had succeeded in getting through the wall, it wouldn't have went anywhere. We had been given bum information.
The most famous escape in the history of Alcatraz occurred in 1962 and was popularized by the Clint Eastwood movie, Escape from Alcatraz. The inmates were Frank Lee Morris and the Anglin brothers, John and Clarence. This attempt exemplifies how creative and clever the inmates at Alcatraz could be, but also how decreased budgets by 1962 had affected security. This is John Anglin's cell. Now, for the Anglins and Morris to escape at night, they had to convince guards that they were sound asleep. So they built dummy heads made out of cement and human hair. Prior to the escape, they also fashioned and used these tools, including this electric drill made out of barber clippers to enlarge the ventilation holes in their cells. Now, in the early days of the prison, none of this would have been possible. These cells were subject to monthly shakedowns or inspections in those days, but by 1962, none of this was happening. Finally, on the night of the escape, the inmates removed false walls and grills and squeezed through the holes in their cells into a utility corridor. The Anglin brothers and Morris scrambled all the way up the pipes to the top of the 3rd tier of cells on B block. Now, this was really a safe place for them because although it was within easy view of the gun gallery, the prison could no longer afford to keep guards stationed there. So for weeks and weeks, this was a private little workshop where the inmates prepared their escape. Now, during this time, they made ingenious equipment such as this life preserver made out of stolen raincoats and this flashlight made out of a battery, a bulb, and a pillbox. Well, on the night of the escape, they gathered their equipment and made for the cell house roof through this hole. The escapees popped the top of a ventilator shaft and came through, and then began to run across the roof of the cell house, carrying with them their equipment, their raft, their life preservers, an air pump, and 100 feet of electrical cord, and they made it right here to this spot. Now, for a long time, that would have been impossible because for many years there was a guard booth back there on the roof of the cell house. But by 1962, with budget cuts, that guard booth had been removed, and the north side of the island was also unprotected. So at night, the escapees were able to move without being seen. They shimmied down a chimney using their electrical cord. They ran to the north side of the island and escaped into the bay. And they were never seen again.
I reported to the president, members of the cabinet, and the...
Within a year, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy ordered Alcatraz to be closed, to balance, he said, the needs of deterrence and detention with the possibilities of rehabilitation. Alcatraz was no longer considered effective in managing incorrigible inmates. That, combined with public criticism of the harshness here and the sheer cost of operating a deteriorating facility, ensured the prison's end. Now, what to do with the island called Alcatraz?
So tired of fighting this war.
By the late 1960s, there was still no decision on the future of Alcatraz. But the times, they were a-changing. Richard Nixon was president. There was a war going on in Vietnam. The civil rights movement was expanding. People were demonstrating, and minorities were discovering new identities and developing new political power. In this environment, Alcatraz became the center of the Native American Indian movement.
One lone little light bulb was up here that lit this way as the 80 Indians came off the boats onto the water barge, up the ramp, while the security guard for the island was jumping up and down and saying, "Mayday, Mayday, the Indians have landed."
On a cold November morning in 1969, a group of American Indians landed on Alcatraz. This wasn't the first occupation by Native Americans. Actually, it was the fourth since the closing of the federal penitentiary. But this one had the numbers and staying power. It would permanently change the image of American Indians and Alcatraz.
The idea of Alcatraz was had a special appeal for us because Alcatraz was an abandoned piece of federal property, a prisoner, and many of us then, as well as many of us today, believed that American Indian reservations were in fact prisoner of war camps at the Indian Wars.
Symbolism, for one thing, and again, visibility. If we had done something like Alcatraz in the remote woods of Mendocino County, or mountains there, how long would we have lasted without the media and public looking right over the shoulders of the government?
Though many of the first Indians on the island were surprised by it, the government was nervous about removing them and causing negative publicity. So a planned overnight show of strength and bravado turned into a 19-month political demonstration.
Our stand is Alcatraz Island. It's a stand of self-determination.
But the days of elation ended quickly. 2 months after the occupation began, tragedy hit the Indians and the family of Richard Oakes, a student leader and unifier on the island. His 12-year-old daughter fell over the third-floor railing of one of the island's apartment buildings. Some said it was murder supported by a rival leader. Others, just an accident. Yvonne Oakes died on January 8th. That same day, Richard Oakes announced that he would end his occupation of Alcatraz. On June 11th, 1971, 20 federal marshals landed and removed the remaining 15 occupiers. The occupation was over, but for the American Indians, it was just the beginning of their political movement.
I think the significance of the Alcatraz occupation is that it demonstrated clearly a growing sophistication on the part of the American Indians to address their needs, their ability to launch massive political movements that clearly endeared themselves to the American people.
Alcatraz Island, its isolation has defined its use and influence through every era of human history, from the early Native American times to the fortress era, from its time as a military prison and federal penitentiary through the Indian occupation, and now is a special example of how humankind and nature can coexist. There's so much here, and each person it touches takes away with him or her their own special meaning.